Hello and welcome to the Functionally Enlightened Podcast with Dr. Sharon Sarita. We interview well-respected medical and functional practitioners, as well as patients who have overcome disabling chronic conditions, such as dysautonomia, and reclaimed their health. These enlightened guests provide helpful tips on managing chronic pain and illnesses, using a combination of traditional and whole-body healing modalities. If you're interested in natural healing and quality of life improvement, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening to today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Functionally Enlightened Podcast. Today, we're joined by Brad Pitzele, who is the founder of 1000 Roads and a passionate voice in the field of exercise with oxygen therapy, also referred to as EWOT, if you've heard that term before, and also red light therapy for chronic illness recovery. So Brad did not come into the work academically or by chance. It really came through survival. After years of mysterious symptoms that he experienced himself, he was diagnosed with autoimmune arthritis, even malignant melanoma, and later Lyme and Bartonella. And we just had a couple of interviews with two specialists in this area, so this is a wonderful adjunct to those talks. And those conditions really left him dealing with profound fatigue, neurological symptoms, and mobility loss, which are symptoms that and conditions that many of us have either experienced ourselves or we've seen a loved one experiencing. So it's going to be very instrumental to learn about everything that he has actually learned and developed in his process to healing. So when conventional treatments, just like for many of us, when they offered no real solutions other than risks, like additional risks that he probably decided against, he began to search for safer and more functional therapies. And that path is what led him to oxygen-based therapies. I'm sure he'll tell us all about those, but he really works nowadays to help others do exactly what he did in healing, and particularly those that are navigating chronic infections like Lyme and long COVID, cancer, autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue syndromes, neurodegenerative and cognitive decline, as well as persistent inflammation that so many of our clients here at Functionally Enlightened deal with due to implant illness. So Brad, we're so glad to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Can you share with us your health journey and the moment that you realized that the traditional approach wasn't going to be enough?
Oh man, yeah, that was I've had like small autoimmune stuff going on since I was a kid, and like weird illnesses that would not illnesses, just weird medical conditions rather. They would kind of come and go. Might see a doctor and get a label put on it, and there was never any treatment for it, and then it would disappear, and like I just moved on with my life. And didn't think anything of it until I guess it was about 2011. I started to develop autoimmune arthritis, and it was really in my hands and a little bit in my feet at first, but mostly my hands. And it got worse, and I went to a rheumatologist, and he was offering me different drugs, and I was trying them, and they weren't doing anything until finally he got to the most powerful drugs, and those were helping me. They would get rid of the symptoms, like they would tamp down the symptoms, maybe not totally get rid of them. They would last for about 6 months, and then they would wear off, and then they would up the dose, and it would wear off, and then they would try another drug in the same class. But after about 2 years of that, I developed melanoma. And one of the side effects of these medications is a higher risk of cancer, and specifically melanoma. So I became very concerned. I had young children at the time. And so I went to my rheumatologist and I said, geez, I kind of feel like I'm in a bind here. If I don't take these drugs, I die a painful death of an autoimmune condition. And if I do take them, I'm at a higher risk of cancer. And he was like, oh, we'll just find another drug in the same class and your body probably won't respond that way. And I just had red lights flashing everywhere inside my head. I was like, wow, we're just going to roll the Russian roulette, again. And so that was when I knew I kind of needed to find another way out. Like I was like, neither of these paths look good. I've got to find a third way, and I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a few of those symptoms. What were the most difficult symptoms to live with, and what really shifted? I guess to start with the symptoms and then your mindset with that.
Well, the worst part about it was when I started, it was the worst symptoms when I started the drugs was the arthritis in my fingers. My fingers would be stiff. I didn't have a lot of grip strength. Um, as I started to do the drugs, I noticed the backs of my legs got very stiff. Like it felt like I just run 100 miles every morning when I'd get up. They were so stiff. I would go in the shower and I'd turn it as hot as I could possibly handle, and I'd like try to stretch down to my toes just to like. And I don't think it really helped a whole lot, but just the hope that it was doing something for me. And then it started to spread into my feet too, and the bottoms of my feet. The way I describe it is, it felt like someone had beaten my bottoms of my feet with a meat hammer. They were so tender. Every step hurt. The only way I could walk was in certain shoes. There was two pair of shoes that were padded enough that I found that I could walk. And it was so bad, like if I had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, I couldn't go barefoot. I had to put those shoes on. So they were by the side of my bed, and I was always afraid if my company was going to send me, not this company, but the business I was working for at the time, if they were going to send me to the airport, the thought of walking through the terminal was so utterly scary. So I would say the foot pain was one. The brain fog and the lack of energy was really difficult because it was just so disruptive. It doesn't hurt, but you just can't think and you can't be yourself. You don't have enough energy to have your personality. Um, and you just can't access your brain. And so it's kind of a frustrating point. And I just think like it was really a constellation of so many different things. It was like it wasn't one big gash. It was like 1,000 paper cuts, all of different symptoms. And, just overall, everything was painful. Everything was foggy. There was no energy to do anything. And it was just a very low quality of life.
Yes, yes. And like many of our listeners, the pharmaceutical approach, like you mentioned, can offer symptom abatement, but it doesn't come
Mhm.
without a cost too. We have our side effects that we typically, and then you had pretty severe side effects based on the
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals you used. So kind of going into your journey now and to searching outside of the box, thinking into the functional health space, how did you begin that journey?
Well, I began, I guess, just Googling, trying to figure things out myself. And I was trying so many different things, anything I could kind of get my hands on, supplements, modalities, treatments. And then I started going on like Facebook groups of different conditions, which I thought maybe I had. I mean, I spent so much time in PubMed too, just trying to figure out what this
Right.
could be and like get ahead of it. And then eventually I ended up finding, I wanted to find a functional medical doctor, someone outside of the mainstream that could offer different things besides the pharmaceutical path. And eventually I ended up at a functional medicine, a holistic doctor. It was a medical doctor, but holistic. Um, and he really helped me. He suggested he tried so many things, nothing worked. Um, like absolutely nothing was working. I think I was probably frustrating the heck out of the poor
Mm,
guy. And then, he suggested we do a Lyme disease test, and I was really resistant to it, and I kind of laughed it off inside. I'm like, I've never been bitten by a tick. I didn't have that bullseye rash. Like, that's not the thing, doc. And it was an expensive test. It was like $500 back in like this is probably what 2017.
mhm.
And I was like, I'm just gonna pay the $500 just to like give him peace of mind so we can move on and find the real thing. That's what I thought in my head.
Right.
Um,
Check the boxes there.
yeah, and he came back and said, "Well, it's positive." And I mean, I still didn't believe it. I was like, "Okay, well, what's the chances of a false positive, doc?" And it was a urine PCR test, which means they test for the DNA of the bacteria in your urine. And he goes to me, he goes, well, you have the DNA of the bacteria that causes Lyme in your urine. So what do you think? And I was like, oh,
Mm.
okay, I guess, yeah, I guess there's only one way that got there, huh? So, yeah. So that was kind of my journey to finding out about Lyme. And then he was also the person who recommended I try this thing, exercise with oxygen therapy, that I'd never heard of.
And so that's a good thing to kind of transition to here for our listeners who are new to EWOT, again, exercise with oxygen therapy, how is that different from hyperbaric chambers that we see more like readily available, but we don't have that much knowledge on?
It's interesting. It's the lesser known cousin of it. It's kind of what I describe it as. They both work in similar ways. So in a hyperbaric chamber, well, the first thing I'll back up and say is in hyperbaric, there's like two different flavors of hyperbaric. There's a hard shell hyperbaric, which is a hard shelled tube that is in a doctor's office. It requires a prescription and medical monitoring. And those can go up to usually they run at about 2.3 atmospheres, and what that means is it's a 1 atmosphere is what we live at sea level, so it's 130% more pressure than you normally feel at sea level. And then there's like soft shell chambers, which you see like athletes and Hollywood types doing at home. Those only go up to like 1.3 atmospheres, so only 30% more pressure. He recommended I do EWOT or the hard shell. Now I'm going to talk about hard shell because that's the more probably the closest relative of EWOT, I'd say, or most comparable. In a hard shell hyperbaric chamber, what the normal protocol is, they put you in there for 90 minutes and they pressurize it. You spend 90 minutes, they depressurize it. And then the pressure is forcing more oxygen through your lungs and into your bloodstream. Now, the challenges several challenges with hyperbaric. There's some risks associated with the high pressures or sudden depressurization. There's issues with cost and time, quite frankly. They can cost, $300 or $500 a session often. It takes several hours plus the time to get there and back. But the other problem is physiologically is once the oxygen gets through into your blood, the hyperbaric chamber is not doing anything on the other side of that lung membrane, if you will. The oxygen is in there. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're at 2.3 atmospheres. That's 130% more pressure, but your blood pressure does not go up 130%. It's because your lung membrane is holding that pressure from reaching your blood. That extra oxygen will cause a slight increase in blood pressure, maybe of like 10%. But then your body, our bodies are so intelligent. And so your body recognizes there's too much oxygen, there's more oxygen than it's used to, and it tries to get back to balance, to homeostasis. Mm-hmm. And so what it does is it creates something called vasoconstriction, where your blood vessels narrow. And so your blood vessels narrow, kind of fighting all that extra oxygen a bit. And so it's a little bit self-limiting. In EWOT, what we do is instead of using pressure to push it in, we use exercise to pull it in. And so if you think about your body, when you start exercising, it immediately recognizes that you're going into an oxygen deficit. I don't have enough oxygen to keep allowing you to exercise. And so it adapts by creating this cascade of physiological changes. You start breathing deeper and heavier more quickly. Your blood starts, or your heart starts beating faster and deeper. Your blood pressure actually goes up significantly, and that's a good thing because that's a force. The force difference between your blood vessels and your cells that are trying to receive the oxygen is actually the bigger that difference, the more it's pushing the oxygen into your cells. And then you also have vasodilation, meaning your blood vessels open up. So all these physiological changes happen with regular exercise. And when we do EWOT, we're basically just hijacking all those physiological differences to allow our body to absorb a massive amount of oxygen in a short period of time. And so like in a 15-minute EWOT session, which is what we typically recommend for folks, you can take in as much oxygen as you would in like 12 or 14 hours in a normal day. And it doesn't have any of the safety risks that you have with hyperbaric. You don't have to worry about the pressure or sudden depressurization. Because you're exercising, there's no risks of oxygen toxicity or getting too much oxygen. So it's one of these things that's safer, faster, cheaper, and quite frankly, a lot of folks who start doing hyperbaric and then come over to do EWOT for a variety of different reasons, whether it's cost or anxiety of being in the tube or whatever it was, they'll tell us they see, faster results and more dramatic results with it. And it's
Mhm.
simply because we're working with the body's physiology.
Yeah, yeah. And so with a lot of the clients that are experiencing post-infection syndromes or implant illness, Asia syndrome, there's always a combination of symptoms that are akin to dysautonomia. So orthostatic hypotension or the converse, where they're having
Yep.
hypertension. And so I'm wondering, as you were speaking with the vasodilation and the constriction, would this be beneficial for either end of that spectrum, whether it's hypo or hyper?
Yeah, so here's the thing, we with people who have high blood pressure, for instance, we recommend exercise, and we know it increases the systolic blood pressure because there's this hormetic effect that happens in exercise that by having these fluctuations in blood pressure, it actually helps our body come back to homeostasis and operate appropriately. So that's not really a risk. Now, with like some of the issues that you spoke about were that obviously you have to be well enough to exercise, right?
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't need to be vigorous exercise, right? So
Okay.
we have folks who start in all stages of chronic illness, and we have folks who are doing it for athletic improvement. So we run the gamut. The really neat thing about oxygen is it will make any exercise you do easier, so you can do more of it without feeling exerted, and it will improve your conditioning rapidly, much more quickly than if you were just doing the exercise alone. So we have folks who start out, maybe they're just walking on a treadmill, or they're bouncing on a rebounder, or they're using one of those pedal bikes that are, you get
Yeah.
on Amazon, used with a regular chair. Um, and they start there and they find after a few months of doing this, they're able to do more and more and more, and they're kind of shocked at where they kind of end up. But you don't need to, don't think of this as like you have to be running a wind sprint or a marathon to get benefits out of this. It's usually we have people starting with mild to moderate exercise and progressing as they listen to their body and their body tells them they should step up.
Perfect, Brad. I'm glad you touched on that because there are so many individuals with dysautonomia that they can only manage a few minutes at a time of short increments, maybe recumbent bike, like you mentioned. So
Yep.
how would that play a role? Would they have to stop the oxygen therapy while they're taking a break between being able to resume the activity, or is that something they can continue?
So the kind of the magic of EWOT. So we've all heard of an oxygen bar where you're stationary and you breathe oxygen.
Mm.
There's some benefit to that. I would describe it as a small benefit compared to what you get with EWOT, because what happens during EWOT, there's this kind of magic. If and sorry for this, is a little bit of a sidetrack, but to explain why what I'm about to say. Um, but normally in our blood, we carry oxygen in our red blood cells. And if you look at your red blood cells, you put a little finger cuff on and measure your oxygen saturation. For all of us, it's going to say it's 98, 99%. So there's not a lot of room in our red blood cells for more oxygen. So, but what happens in both hyperbaric oxygen and in EWOT is when you flood the body with oxygen, you actually push oxygen to saturate inside the blood plasma. And blood plasma normally doesn't carry oxygen.
Mm.
It's this clearish brown liquid that the red blood cells ride on. And that's important for a couple reasons. One, blood plasma is about 1,000 times thinner than a red blood cell. So it's able to get into places in your body that, in your circulatory system, that maybe are kind of clogged up due to inflammation, etc., and actually get to those places and reoxygenate cells that are starved. But it also increases the overall oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So when you're exercising, you're taking advantage of that. If you're stationary, very little of that is occurring, but there's no harm in it. So if I were to talk to someone who had that condition, what I would suggest is, if you're going to do 5 minutes on and take a rest and go back to it, just keep the mask on. That's perfectly fine. It also helps with recovery, and it'll help make sure that your mitochondria are getting the oxygen they need to regenerate energy, so that when you go back to it, you're not feeling overexerted. but don't really think about that as so much a therapeutic time as much as it's just helping a little bit with the recovery.
Yeah, and you also integrate red light therapy. You mentioned mitochondria, so that's where I'm shifting here. How do these therapies complement each other at the mitochondrial level?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So red light's much more well known. When I say red light, I mean red and near infrared lights.
Right, right.
They're just different wavelengths of light. Um, And what happens is when you shine specific wavelengths of red and near infrared light on the body, it gets absorbed by our cells and specifically our mitochondria. And when the mitochondria absorb these spectrums of light, they cause the mitochondria to demand more oxygen. They pull more oxygen in. And so they work really synergistically because you've got EWOT, which is massively increasing your oxygen supply. Like I said, in 15 minutes, you can take in 12 or 14 hours of oxygen. So you're just flooded, your plasma, your red blood cells everywhere. And then you immediately afterwards, you get underneath red or near infrared light, or preferably both. And now you're driving all your mitochondria to increase their demand of this oxygen. And that's important. We think of mitochondria as this little powerhouse and the energy of the cells, which it is, but it's not just about energy and feeling awake, right? Every cell needs energy to do its function. Your liver works better when it has the ATP to utilize to detox. Your brain needs the ATP for memory and for processing. Your heart, every cell in your body, whatever its function, this is the base fuel it needs. And so when we give it more of it, it performs better. And so if you look at all the benefits of red light, everything from skin health, that's it's shining on the skin cells and they have more energy, so they start producing more collagen, so they heal faster. They reduce the wrinkles that you get as you have collagen loss as you age, all these sorts of effects. Benefits for the eyes, benefits for the bones. It's the same mechanism, which is causing increased oxygen demand, which is allowing every cell in the body to function at its best.
Mm-hmm. So let's go into the practicality of its use. So you mentioned it can often be inconvenient, time-consuming, expensive to go and do HPOT treatment. But what about your form of treatment here?
That's actually the biggest thing for me. So when I started to get better from these therapies, I wanted to create a company to make this easier for folks to do these and make them more accessible. And so that's what we set out to do, because I've seen it so many times and I believe it so deeply, which is the best oxygen therapy is the one you can do consistently over time. So if you can do it multiple times a week, then, for a long period of time, you're going to see tremendous benefits. Now, I would say, like, you can do hyperbaric. I think there's a good place for hyperbaric. If you're too sick for exercise, hyperbaric may be a good use case for you. If you're diabetic and you have an open wound, I think hyperbaric might be better for you as long as they're filling the entire chamber with oxygen and not just using a mask, because it forces oxygen into that wound. And I think you can do hyperbaric as a heroic treatment for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, but past that, I always found in my healing journey, if whatever your protocol is, regardless of what it is, if it ends up taking up so many hours of your day, at some point you just kind of give up. You're like, yeah, it's helping, but like it takes me 6 hours and I have no time for me, and like I can't because I got to take care of my home life and my work life and whatever it is. And so that's kind of the amazing thing I find about this is it's something you can do in your home, and it takes 15 minutes a session, which most of us can find 15 minutes for the EWOT. And then red light takes about 10 or 15 minutes. So you can do both components in less than a half hour and get tremendous benefits. And it's easy to be consistent when you have the flexibility to do it on your schedule without having to schedule with anybody else, without having to drive anywhere else. Easy peasy, half hour done, so to speak.
And you hit the nail on the head with those long-term treatments and them being more of a stressor than a healing agent in the life.
Yeah.
I've seen so many people burn out from that, and then they resume old lifestyles, and then they wind up stuck again. So
Yeah.
with this, I'm also thinking about the logistics of being able to do something in the home, especially with those who have limited mobility. You mentioned they could do whatever form of exercise that is getting the oxygen flowing naturally. So could
That's right.
you give us kind of a walkthrough of what other additional equipment they're going to be using with this therapy, or
That's
just
great. You can use, so our EWOT systems come with everything but the exercise equipment. Now,
right?
we have people starting in a variety of different places. Some are starting with gentle stretching and calisthenics or aerobics in their living room, and that's it. We have, but you can do anything. You can do a rebounder. I mentioned the pedal bike. You can use exercise bikes, recumbent or regular ellipticals, treadmills, any piece of cardio equipment you can think of, rowing machines. We have people using with these. So, and when people come to me and ask me, like, hey, what's the absolute best? I always come back to them and say, the absolute best is the one you like the most. Because what I really want you to do is I want you to do this. I think you'll see incremental benefits into years 2 and 3. And so my goal is to get you to do it consistently over time. And what I usually find is after folks have done it for a few months, they see so many benefits that, they really don't want to quit. Like I have folks sometimes call us and say, hey, how long till I can stop doing this? And I'm like, what you're going to find is after you've done it for a few months, you're like, it's 15 minutes and I feel so good. I'm just going to keep doing it. And there's so many health benefits to even those of us who are no longer dealing with or never have dealt with chronic health issues.
And how do you monitor progress? Is there a questionnaire? Are there functional labs that you run?
Well, I think it's generally just functionally, how are they doing? Symptom disappearance, quality of life, energy. And we just hear back from we hear back from our customers all the time. I mean, that's actually the best part about this business, if I'm honest, is when we get the customer who calls us back and tells us their success story, because I know what a dark place it is when you don't have any hope and you're in that kind of spiral. And so like some of those stories are my favorite, but that generally it's just their stories. But I've kind of shifted mindsets. When I started, I told you I spent a lot of time in PubMed. I spent a lot of time on Facebook groups, Reddit groups,
Hmm.
Googling, all the things we all do, trying to get any information. And I think those are good and they're powerful. And I found over time the things that mattered more to me wasn't what I was reading in science, but it was what was happening with real people. You know what I mean? Because that's what mattered to me. I don't care if it was 2.6% better. I want to know if someone felt better and they could go do something with their kid again. Like, hey, that's more meaningful outcomes to me. So,
Hmm.
yeah, we hear back from our customers, and you can even read some of it in the reviews on our website. We have customer reviews. There's some pretty cool ones in there. People talking about the benefits they're seeing.
Yeah, and I always agree with that too. Everyone is a N of one case study. No one's going to
Yes.
respond to the same thing. But whenever we can find modalities such as this, that we know there can only be positive impacts, even in I can go as far as saying just having that structure as part of your routine and getting that movement time that it's going to be, hey, I invested time in this, I invested money in this, I'm going to make it my daily routine. The body craves structure. And if we can get that movement piece incorporated in it, along with, the dietary things that we need to work on too,
Yes.
and there's supplemental supports that might, I guess, work in synergy with EWOT. So are there any tips that you can give people in terms of synergistically trying to make this as set a routine as possible and also to see as much improvement as possible?
Yeah. So what I'd say is, I tell folks, you just need to do one session, like three. Goal is to get to 3 to 5 times a week. You may not start there. You may start, with one session and it may not even be 15 minutes, right? Sort of thing. But as it helps you, you'll get there. I find that if you can commit yourself to doing it like at least 3 times a week as you get up there, it becomes kind of self rewarding, and it becomes kind of this positive loop where you're noticing benefits, and you want to do it. And so that's the biggest thing, is starting out early and giving yourself time. Because we often have folks who come to us and say like, well, I want to do this and I want to do these 7 other things. And I'm always like, well, here's here's what I'm girding against for you is you get all 7, it takes you 2.5 hours, you throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, I'm just not doing any of it. It's too much.
Mhm.
I always say like, just start with one of these. Just start with, and my recommendation is EWOT, to be quite honest. I found it is the most powerful thing. And if you can just do it and commit to do it for 3 months, when you get to 3 months, evaluate and see what else you need to add to it. Um, because it does so many things. That was kind of the shocking thing for me is how many like positive things oxygen does for your body. It's astounding. Like one of the ones that really was like a light bulb moment for me, Sharon, was when I realized I read this research and it was basically anywhere in your body you have inflammation, you have low oxygen. And the opposite is also true. Anywhere in your body you have low oxygen, you have inflammation. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. And
Mhm.
that was a light bulb moment for me. It's like, well, gosh, I have inflammation. Well, clearly, then I must have low oxygen. And the problem is with when you're in a chronic condition, you have inflammation. That inflammation also exists inside your circulatory system. And what happens is your capillaries, the endothelial cells, which are the lining of your blood, your circulatory system, they actually they swell from this inflammation, and some of them swell shut. And red blood cells cannot get through, and all the cells downstream are now starved of oxygen, which makes them more inflamed. They're like in a low energy state, which means they're just like in a survival mode. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They don't have any energy for repair. They're just kind of slogging through. And when they're in that mode, they also develop all this metabolic waste and they just let all these toxins build up inside the cell wall. So it becomes this negative feedback loop where things just get worse and worse. And when you can reestablish oxygen to those cells and create an anti-inflammatory effect in the circulatory system so that you reopen those pathways, you help with detoxification, you help with energy and recovery, you help the immune system get stronger. Like there's just all these things, they start like stacking on top of each other. And I think that's why folks start feeling better and better and it becomes self-reinforcing.
Yeah, and I love what you pointed out about the clinical practice versus the research. I'm a very data-driven person, so not just looking at the statistics with, a double-blind peer-reviewed study, but also in the clinical practice, I'm sure there's a significant change in that symptom burden score. So this being a
Yes.
modality that I haven't recommended to my clients, I'm going to definitely dive into it a little bit more and see if that's something that can be readily incorporated into at least, the people who are willing to participate in my next study. Right now, I'm closing off a study on GI health and with respective dietary shifts and nutritional supplements. So as I close that off, I'm looking back into the lifestyle pillar because so many times we get that supplement fatigue and we want to do something that our body will feel innately better, like you mentioned with this, with the exercise and the increased oxygen. I know that just based on the literature that we're going to see shifts in all of the inflammatory markers that we often look at, like HSCRP. You can probably look at an iron ferritin panel and see, the oxygen
Yeah.
influx that is improving all of the systemic, even detoxification, if we're thinking about it, like pushing out the bad. And just again, with the science background, I was an environmental engineer in my prior life, and I'm thinking, normally our oxygen intake in the air we breathe is so minimal, and people aren't aware of that. It's like 20% of what we're breathing, 20 something percent,
That's right.
versus nitrogen being so high. So just the impacts. I wonder, mood wise, is there a difference mood wise?
Yes, yeah. We benefits we see do include, improved depression, anxiety. Also, we see benefits in better sleep, which obviously is self-reinforcing for all of our moods. Any of us who struggle with sleep know that one all too well. So higher quality of sleep. And obviously, if you have more energy in the day and you're sleeping better at night, which is giving you even more energy in the day, those two things in and of themselves just elevate the spirit so much because you have room in your body to be you, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we pivot from here, Are there any precautions or contraindications that you've seen maybe for the population that I serve?
The only issue we see is the only group we say you absolutely shouldn't do this is if you're not healthy enough to exercise. So layering in oxygen to your exercise doesn't really have any risks. Um, in general, when you think about challenges with oxygen, there's really two challenges. One is oxygen toxicity. So what happens in oxygen toxicity? So if you were sitting on your couch and just breathing oxygen, it would take over a day of breathing oxygen to get oxygen toxicity for most folks. And what it is that the oxygen basically gets trapped in your circulatory system and it can't get out. So this can happen to divers. It can technically also happen in a hyperbaric chamber, but usually if it's medically supervised, that's not shouldn't happen. Um, so when you're dealing with pressure and oxygen in EWOT, you can't get oxygen toxicity for a couple reasons. One, I mentioned it's about 12 to 14 hours of oxygen. That's not over 24. But even if we could give you more oxygen, your body's producing a massive amount of carbon dioxide when you exercise. People think carbon dioxide is just a waste gas, but it also serves a purpose in our body. And one of those purposes is it creates pressure in our blood, and that pressure forces the oxygen to exit the circulatory system and into the cells. And so even if you could do EWOT for, many, many hours, you couldn't get oxygen toxicity. So that's one thing that's cool is it's inherently safe.
Right.
The other thing you'll hear about oxygen is flame risk.
Yeah.
Oxygen isn't flammable like gasoline. So if you were to take our oxygen hose and put a lighter to the end of it, you wouldn't create a flamethrower or anything like that. But if you have a fire that's burning, it'll make it burn hotter and faster. So we do get questions on occasion about, well, is this a risk? I'm going to put this in my house. And generally, the risk is very small. So the risk would be if you had a fire in your house and the reservoir were filled with oxygen and it got to the reservoir when it was big enough to burn through it, then it'll make it burn hotter and faster. But as I always point out to folks is if you have a fire in your house and it already got to there and it already was big enough to burn, you should be out of that house.
Very true. Very true.
So we have never had, knock on wood, thank God, I've never heard a story of anyone having any issues with that. You just keep it away from gas appliances and candles and smoking and like common sense sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
People put it in their garage, they put it in their bedroom, they put it, even sometimes on a covered porch or something, no problem. So, not really. If you're healthy enough for exercise, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. That threw me back to my grad studies whenever I was working in the chemistry lab and we had the GC machine and the mass spec, and I would always be scared to leave the tank on. So I would go back, like check it 3 or 4 times. But the same principle there, it's high concentration, of course, but it's not going to ignite.
No, it's not a gasoline. It's not a flammable. And the truth of the matter is the device we use to produce that oxygen, it actually purifies the oxygen out of the air from the room it's in. So net, the room still has similar levels of oxygen. It's just concentrated in one part versus the other. So, yeah.
I like that you brought that in, Brad, about the purifying of the existing air. So this is not something that they need to maintain by having delivery. They can actually produce within the confines of their home.
That's one of the things that makes this so accessible over time is it's a one-time purchase for the most part. There's a device, an electrical device, and you plug it in and turn it on, and it separates the oxygen from the nitrogen and argon, and it purifies it from 21% up to 93%. And so you're breathing near pure oxygen, and you've got effectively an endless supply. And really, once you buy the system, the only things you have to purchase is maybe every year and a half or 2 years, your mask kind of gets a little gross from sweating and spitting in it. And even though you've washed it, you kind of want a new one. It's a little worn out, so you might get a new mask. Or, there's air filters on the intakes of the device. And probably about every 18 months or so, you get a new air filter. So small things. So that's like, when you're dealing with chronic illness, that's the hard thing too, right? Is the ongoing cost of everything. And we've all spent so much money trying to get ourselves back to good that, you often don't have, it's not an endless fountain, if you will. And so I think that's another thing that makes it attractive is it's something you buy once and you can use for many, many years.
It sounds like an amazing modality, like I said, for our listeners and, for family or friends, share this information. So where can our listeners learn more or work with your team or maybe explore a little bit more about EWOT therapy?
Absolutely. So if you can go to our website, 1000roads, all spelled out.com, ONETHOUSANDROADS.com. And you can find out more there. Or we've also launched a YouTube channel where we put out weekly videos. You can learn more about EWOT and red light. We put out things on the science. We put out stories about how people are recovering, which I think is every bit as important for people to hear and have hope. Our YouTube channel is 1000 Roads HQ, all spelled out.
Very good. We'll include that in our show notes. Brad, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate this information. Again, all new, so I'm sure it's going to be very, very well received here.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate your time.
All right. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe. Again, share this with a family member, a loved one, anyone who needs to learn about these healing modalities that can become part of their routine. Thank you so much. We'll see you on the next one.